All right, so I think we're ready to go. So today we have Andrew Lewis-Pye from London School of Economics, going to be talking about consensus. And I'll just remind that we do have 2 more seminars this week. Tomorrow we have Ling Ren, who's visiting, who's going to talk about BFT protocols. And I believe Thursday we have Andy again.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so this is going to be a nice, easy introduction to consensus. That's the idea. So I'm going to start off by assuming like zero background knowledge, or essentially zero background knowledge. The idea is that, so today and Thursday, I'm going to go through most of the most famous results from the literature with full proofs. Okay. So I guess if you already know a fair amount about consensus, I guess the first part, because I'm starting right at the beginning, the first part might be a little bit slow, but okay, even if you know a fair amount, I hope that it gets interesting at least like halfway through the first talk. Okay, so hold on. Okay. And before we start proper, I guess, a crucial distinction that has to be made here is between permissionless and permissioned protocols, right? So I guess everyone's probably familiar with this idea already. Okay, but basically, permissioned protocols are those where you know exactly who's involved in the protocol execution right from the start, okay? So maybe there's some company, they've got like 5 servers in different parts of the world, and those servers are going to carry out some permission protocol to make sure that they're updating data correctly between them, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's a permission protocol, because you know exactly who's involved, as opposed to a permissionless protocol like Bitcoin, where anybody can join in, I mean, you don't necessarily know who those people are and so on. Okay. So most of the classical theory dating back to the 1980s is with respect to the permission protocols, right? Often that might be with respect to what are called BFT protocols, right? Where BFT stands for Byzantine fault tolerant. Okay, nowadays there's renewed interest in permission protocols, partly just because there's interest in implementing those protocols as permission protocols directly, but also because there are basic methods you can use for implementing permission protocols as permissionless protocols. Okay, so there are methods you can use for taking a permission protocol and implementing it in a permissionless setting, maybe as a proof of stake protocol or something like that. Okay, so in this course, I'm going to be focusing initially at least on the permission protocols, okay, because that's where most of the theory is. But then on Thursday, I'll also talk a little bit about how the theory for permission protocols and permissionless protocols, how those theories relate. Okay. Good. Okay, so let's go right back to the start then. So we want to study consensus protocols. First of all, I guess what we have to know is what is the problem a consensus protocol has to solve? And there are various different ways you can answer that question. Maybe the most famous consensus problem is the Byzantine agreement problem. Okay, so let's start with that one. And I'm going to start off by giving like an informal version of the problem. I'm just going to state it basically exactly like it is in the original paper by Lamport, Shostak and Peace, which comes right back in the 1980s. Right, so we'll start off with an informal version and then I'll make it formal later on. Okay, so we've got several divisions of the Byzantine army camped outside an enemy city, each division commanded by its own general. Okay, and here it's basically only the generals we care about. Okay, the rest is just part of the story. Okay. And then the generals can communicate only by messenger. Okay, so the generals are communicating in pairs here, right? So at any given point in time, each general can choose to send a message to each of the other generals, or one of the other generals in particular, right? And they can do that as many times as they like. Okay, so the generals can communicate only by messenger, and they have to carry out a protocol to decide on a common plan of action, either attack or retreat. Okay, so initially each general has their own private opinion as to whether you should attack or retreat. You can sort of think of that as being their input in this scenario, okay? And so initially they have their own private opinion, if you like, their input. So the difficulty here is that some of the generals might be dishonest. Okay, so they're going to carry out this protocol, whereas the honest generals are going to carry out the protocol exactly as you want them to, but the dishonest generals, we don't know what they're going to do. Okay? And we want certain basic conditions to be satisfied. So first of all, we want to make sure that the honest generals terminate, they actually come to some conclusion. Okay, so obviously here we can't insist anything from the dishonest generals because we don't know what they're going to do. Okay, but for the honest generals, we can insist certain things. So we're going to require the honest generals have to reach a decision. We're going to require that they all reach the same decision. Okay, all the honest generals. And then lastly, we're going to require that if all the honest generals start with the same opinion, if they all have the same input, then that common input should be their common output. Okay, so we've got a bunch of people here, a bunch of generals, each have an input. They have to go through some protocol, they each have to decide on some common answer. If they all start with the same input, they all have to give that common input as their output. Okay, so so this is like an informal version of the problem. As I say, I'll give you a formal version in a bit. But even with this sort of informal version, there are various sort of things we can already say, right? So let's start sort of prodding around and see what we can immediately see. So the first basic point to make here is that without the validity requirement, right, it's pretty clear this would be trivial, right? So without validity, basically all the honest generals could do, they could just ignore their input and they could all just decide to attack whatever, right? Okay. So certainly validity is required to make this interesting. Yeah, otherwise it'd be a trivial solution. First observation. Okay, so what I've done here, I've just restated the problem more succinctly and moved it to the top of the slide, and I put a red line around it. Okay? And I've also introduced some more terminology here. So I'm always going to use N for the number of parties, the number of generals. Okay, and F is going to be some upper bound on the number of dishonest generals here. Okay, so what else can we say, even with the informal version? So for clarity, let's suppose that the honest generals know F. Okay, they're given some bounds, they know that bound, and that's common knowledge. Okay, but obviously they can't know, well, let's say they don't know like which of the dishonest generals. If they know which of the dishonest ones, it makes it sort of trivial as well, because you just ignore them, right? Okay, so but they have some upper bound on the number of dishonest guys here. So next obvious observation, so if F is 0, then the problem is trivial, right? Because in that situation, we just do a majority vote, right? Everyone would each general can send their initial opinion to everybody else. Everyone will end up with the same list of opinions, right? Nobody's lying. Just do a majority vote. If there are ties, then break it in some arbitrary prearranged fashion, something like that, okay? Okay, so if F is 0, then it's trivial. Okay, so it's clear then that one of the basic questions we're going to be interested in is for what values of N and F is it possible to design a protocol here, right? So that's one of our basic questions. Okay, the next easy observation is, okay, so it's also pretty obviously not going to be possible if F is greater or equal to N over 2, right? If we have a dishonest majority here. Okay, so let's take you through a sort of simple proof of that. So let's suppose we've got two generals. Okay, let's suppose they're given the inputs attack and retreat. Okay, that's when they're starting. Okay, and let's suppose that they're going to both act entirely honestly. Okay, in this situation, they have to come up with some common output, right, to satisfy the agreement property. So they've got to decide on something. Everything's entirely symmetrical here so far. So without loss of generality, let's suppose that they decide to attack in that situation. Okay. Hopefully you're happy, everything's perfectly general so far because it's symmetrical. I could decide they retreat and it would be a symmetrical argument. Okay, so we've got two honest generals. One has initial position attack, that's their input. The other one has initial position retreat. Okay, let's suppose they decide to attack in that scenario. Okay, in that case, fine. So now let's consider another situation. Now again, we've got two generals. Let's suppose they're both given input retreat. But let's suppose that this guy is actually dishonest, and what he decides to do is to pretend that his input was attack, and then after that, just act like an honest general would. Yeah. So then you already know what happens in that scenario, right? So now everyone's acting honestly after that point, so then the output then is attack, right? So that's the output in this scenario as well. But now we've got a conflict with validity, right? Because this general here, so all of the honest generals, in fact, had the input retreat here, right? But they decided to attack. Okay, so that's quite simple. Okay, so if F is 0, it's trivially solvable. If F is greatly equal to N over 2, got a dishonest majority, then it's sort of fairly trivially non-solvable, right? And then I guess so the next thing you might think is, okay, so when F is less than N over 2, well, maybe then it's still like trivially solvable. So maybe it's trivially unsolvable when F is greater than N over 2. Maybe it's trivially sort of solvable when it's less than N over 2, okay? In particular, so you might think, well, why can't we just do some sort of majority vote type thing? Okay. So yeah, well, the problem with that approach stems basically from the allowed form of communication here. Okay, we're having the generals communicate in pairs. If you had a scenario where, okay, imagine everyone's just sort of standing around in a circle and they're shouting out their votes, right? So that means that whenever any general shouts out, maybe like their initial input, or whatever, everybody hears that, so they all hear the same thing. So you can't say different things to different people. Well, then it would be trivial, right? Then you could just do a majority vote argument. Okay, so in that case it would be trivial, but that's not our setup here, okay? So here we're having communication between pairs, one pair of generals at a time. And then the problem now is that the dishonest generals can tell different things to different parties, right? Okay, so to make that concrete, let's suppose n is 3, we've got 3 different parties involved here. We've got f is 1, so at most one of the generals is going to be dishonest. Let's suppose one honest general initially wants to attack, while the other one wants to retreat. Okay, if the dishonest general sends a retreat message to the one who wants to retreat and an attack message to the one who wants to attack, then they'll both see different majorities, right? One who wants to attack will see an attack majority, the one who wants to retreat will see a retreat majority. Okay, so majority vote doesn't work. And in fact, okay, you can show basically there's no, no really trivial answer is going to work here because, well, in fact, you can show that there's no solution that works when f is greater than or equal to n over 3, unless you endow the generals with some extra capabilities, okay? Okay, so it's maybe not as easy as it might initially seem. Okay, so that's sort of initial sort of prodding around the edges as to what the problem feels like, okay? So next thing we have to do is to establish our formal framework. It's maybe a bit boring, but unfortunately it's really necessary to be careful with the details here. I mean, generally, I think like consensus isn't very difficult in the sense that the protocols don't tend to be very complicated. What makes it tricky is that like small little changes in the setup can make big differences to the answer. Right? You set things up one way, and you get a certain set of answers. You change things a little bit, you get a completely different set of answers. So you have to sort of memorize all these different possibilities. Okay, so we're going to formalize the framework and sort of outline what the different possibilities are that make a difference. Okay, so we're going to, I guess, unsurprisingly, we formalize each general as a processor. Doesn't really matter how you do that, just take your favorite model of computation, imagine them to be interactive Turing machines, if you like. Okay. Then we're going to have the execution of the protocols are going to be divided up into discrete time slots. Okay, so we're going to start off at time slot 0, then we have time slot 1, time slot 2, and so on. At each time t, each processor receives a certain set of messages from the other processors. Okay, and then depending on what those messages are, it carries out some finite set of instructions. Okay, and those instructions allow it to decide what messages it sends out to other processors at that time slot. Yeah.
So here under you assume synchronicity.
We'll come to that in a second.
So it's not how that.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a few possibilities, and we'll start off simple, and then we'll sort of get more complicated. Okay, so each time slot, you get a certain set of messages, you go through some finite set of calculations, right, and then you decide what messages to send out. Okay. So there are n processors, right, and we're going to give them names 0 up to n minus 1. Might seem a bit odd to do 0 up to n minus 1 more than 1 to n, but it makes it easier to work mod n when you're doing talking about stuff. Okay. So each processor here is told n, and they're also told their own name. Okay, so that's part of their input. And then we have authenticated channels. Okay, so there's like a two-way channel between each pair of processors here. Okay, so for each pair of processors I and j, we've got a channel ij. Okay, and the way that works is quite simple. So only I can send messages to j, and only j can send messages to I on the channel ij. Okay. And when I receives messages, it's aware of the channel by which the message was sent. Okay, so if it gets a message on a particular channel, if it gets a message on the channel ij, it knows that message was from j. Okay, so each processor sitting there has got a bunch of authenticated channels, and it knows who's at the end of each channel. Right? So if a message arrives on that channel, it knows who the message is from. Okay. Yeah, and as I said, so at each time slot, the instructions for processor I determine which messages it should send along each of its channels. Okay, then sometimes we want to assume public key infrastructure, sometimes not. Okay, so if you're given a PKI, public key infrastructure, that just means each processor is given like a secret key, public key pair, okay? And it's told the public key of each of the other processors, okay? So as it looks along each of its channels, it knows at the end of this channel, there's processor J, and this is their public key. Okay. Okay, so now we have to get to how reliable do we want message delivery to be? It makes quite a big difference. Okay, so okay, so to keep things simple, I'm going to start off in the sort of the easiest setting, right? So I'm going to start off in what we call the synchronous setting. So that means if I send J a message at time slot t, then J receives that message at the next time slot, at time slot t plus 1. Okay, so that's the synchronous setting. Another version of the synchronous setting might be that you have some finite bound delta. Okay, so if I send a message at time slot t, then J receives it by time t plus delta, right, at the latest. Basically, for our purposes here, the distinction isn't that important. It isn't very interesting because any theorem we talk about here will hold for one if and only if it holds for the other with basically the same proof or easy modification. Okay, so just to keep things simple, I'm just going to have this really sort of the simplest possible version of the synchronous setting. To have in mind, it could be slightly different. All the same results will hold, at least as far as the stuff we're talking about now is concerned. Yeah?
Sorry, and it is okay to assume that you can send multiple messages at the same time.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. We're just saying you can send some sort of data if you want to sort of call it multiple messages. Yes, I mean, okay, certainly you can send multiple messages to different processors as well. So there's no, yeah.
But if I send all of them at time t, all of them will reach at time t plus 1.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that the first one is sent at time t.
No, okay.
So you can
Yeah.
parallel.
So I can send a message to each of the other participants at any given time slot, and they'll all arrive at the next time slot. Yeah. Okay. Okay, then we also have to decide how dishonest generals can behave. So we'll talk about the following way. So some of the processors are faulty, okay, or maybe faulty. So as I said before, so each processor is given an upper bound f for the number of faulty processors as part of its input. We're always going to suppose that's known. And generally, we're going to be most interested in analyzing settings where the faulty processors can just display arbitrary behavior. Okay, in particular, they might be malicious, right? So they might be trying to muck things up. Okay, so in that case, we say the processors display Byzantine faults. Okay, so they can just follow some arbitrary program. Everything I'm talking about so far, by the way, I haven't put it in the slides. We're going to imagine everything's deterministic so far. Okay. You also, you might want to consider other sorts of faults. Okay, for different settings, different sorts of faults might be interesting. So you might also consider crash faults. So if you consider crash faults, that means basically processors have to sort of follow the protocol precisely up until maybe some point where they crash, and then after that point they just stop doing anything. Okay, but mainly we're going to be interested in Byzantine faults because that tends to be one that people are interested in the blockchain setting. Right? And then just a little bit of informal terminology. So often we'll talk about an adversary. Okay. So often it'd be convenient to think of all the faulty processors that are displaying arbitrary behaviors being sort of coordinated by some adversaries, trying to sort of coordinate their actions so as to be as difficult as possible. Okay. So sometimes it's necessary to formally define the notion of adversary, but for all the stuff I'm going to talk about in these tutorials, it's not. Okay, so it's just an informal term. Okay, so that's basically the sort of the formal setup, if you like. So what's our research program then? Okay, so the questions we want to answer are basically these. So for which N and F do there exist protocols to solve the Byzantine agreement problem? Okay, and other forms of the problem. I'll define some other ones as well. How does that depend on the various possibilities we talked about there? So how does it depend on things like message reliability, right? Like whether we're working in a synchronous setting, or whether we're working in settings that make weaker assumptions on message reliability. Okay, so maybe I should have said before, so in the synchronous setting, we're starting off in the synchronous setting. That's a pretty strong assumption, so after a little bit we'll relax that and we'll talk about other settings like the partially synchronous setting where message delivery might be sometimes much less reliable. Okay, and that will change the set of results we get and the set of protocols we have to use. How does that all depend on the form of faulty behavior, right? Whether we're talking about Byzantine faults or crash faults. Again, Byzantine faults just means you can behave any way whatsoever. Okay, and how does it all depend on whether or not you have a public key infrastructure? Okay, that also makes a big difference. Okay, so that's the basic, those are the questions we're looking to answer. And the order in which we're going to do that is as following. So we're going to start off in the synchronous setting, the simplest setting. First of all, in fact, basically, we're just going to concentrate on Byzantine faults, I think. Right, I'm going to determine for which N and F Byzantine agreement is possible, depending on whether a PKI is given. Okay, and that makes a difference. Okay, then we'll consider the same question for crash faults this time, and then we'll do the whole thing again for weaker assumptions about message delivery. Okay. Okay, and also we won't just talk about the Byzantine agreement problem. I'm sort of focusing on that to make things simple at the beginning, but we'll also talk about some other forms of the problem. Okay, so Byzantine broadcast and state machine replication are two other important variants. So basically, state machine replication is just what Bitcoin solves, okay, in some sense. Okay, so right, so I stated Byzantine agreement before in a slightly informal way, but also the version I stated before was like a binary version of the problem. So there were two options, attack or retreat, right? So sometimes it's useful to have a more general form, so let's write that down. Okay, so we consider a set of n processes, most f, maybe 40. And then for some set v, okay, each processor is given an input in v. Okay, obviously different processors might get different initial inputs. We're going to imagine v is told to all the processors, n could be of any finite size greater than or equal to 2. It doesn't really matter that it's finite here. All I care about is that v is decidable. Okay, so processors can determine whether any given value is in v. Okay. Okay, then we just have the conditions we said before. Okay, so we need termination. All non-faulty processors must give an output in v. Okay, agreement. They all have to get the same output. Again, validity, the same as before. So if all non-faulty processes have the same input, then that's got to be their common output. Okay, so that's the Byzantine agreement problem. Hopefully you have that sort of memorized now because we're going to be using that for the rest of the talk. Good.
Are they allowed to output something not in V?
No, exactly right. So you have to give an output in V. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
So are there ever like formulations of this that consider a fairness notion of like if one node could sort of force the outcome to be what they want it to be, even if like, assume it's a valid output, but it's maybe not what everybody else started with?
So you're talking about something other than the sort of broadcast version of the problem. It sounds a bit like the broadcast version. But
the broadcast or not, it's just like the notion of like you get everybody to agree on an output that's in V that's valid. But if you, like, maybe you don't want one node to just, like, be able to dictate the whole process by deviating from the protocol.
Yeah, well, so if you solve this, and, you know, if you've got a protocol that works for large F, you won't have one node be able to dictate it. Do you mean one honest node not be able to dictate it, or any faulty node not be able to dictate it?
Well, like, maybe one faulty node can steer everybody.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, I mean... You mean, okay, so you're going to have to satisfy validity, but so you're saying in scenarios where they don't have the same input, you still don't want them having that much influence. Yeah, okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay, I'm not sure about that. Yeah, maybe. Okay. Okay, so that's our first version. That's Byzantine agreement. Then here's another variant, which you're going to have to memorize. Okay, so it's a simple variant though. So in fact, in the original paper where Lamport, Shostak, and Peace introduced the Byzantine agreement problem, they really focus most of the time on this variant called the Byzantine broadcast problem. Okay, well, it's now called the Byzantine broadcast problem. So the setup now is similar. So we've got n processors, F, faulty. So now one processor is designated the broadcaster. Okay, so they're given a special role. Everybody knows who the broadcaster is. Okay, that's part of your input. Now only the broadcaster is given an input. Okay, so the broadcaster is given an input in some set V. And again, V is told to all the processors. Okay, now we have to satisfy the following conditions. So again, so termination. So all non-faulty processors have to give an output in V, similar to before. Agreement, they all have to give the same output. But now the validity condition is different. Okay, so now if the broadcaster is non-faulty and has input V, then all non-faulty processors have to give that value as their output. Okay, so it's kind of similar, but now we've got one particular processor with a distinguished from the others, and the idea is that he's trying to tell everybody his value. Everybody should agree on that value, right? If he's non-faulty, everybody will agree on that value. even if he's faulty, they're still going to agree on some value, but obviously not necessarily his value. Yeah. You happy with that? Okay, so we've got two different versions of the problem. In the Byzantine agreement, everyone's given an input. They have to determine some common output. And if they're all given the same input, their common input has to be that output. In the broadcast version of the problem, it's simply we've got a particular node who's the broadcaster. Everybody has to output the same output. And if the broadcaster is honest, then you have to output his value. Okay? Okay. Okay, so now you've got two different versions of the problem. I guess the natural question is, well, so how do they relate? Are they essentially the same? Hopefully they're the same, so we forget about it and go back to one version of the problem, right? Okay, so to what extent are these the same? So we saw before that Byzantine agreement can't be solved when f is greater than or equal to n over 2, when we have a dishonest majority, right? That was a sort of simple argument with two different generals, yeah? It's easy to see, though, and I won't go through it, but it's easy to see that the same argument doesn't apply to Byzantine broadcast. And in fact, we'll see that if a PKI is given, and if we work in a synchronous setting, then there are protocols for solving Byzantine broadcast that can deal with any number of faulty processes. Okay, so they're not exactly the same problem. There are some scenarios, at least, where you can solve BB, Byzantine broadcast, and not Byzantine agreement. Okay. On the other hand, okay, if we're working in the synchronous setting, this won't necessarily be true in other settings, we work in the synchronous setting, and if f is less than n over 2, so this is the sort of the realm in which you can solve Byzantine agreement, maybe, yeah, then the two problems reduce to each other quite easily. Okay, so let's see that. So on the one hand, if we can solve Byzantine broadcast, okay, then to solve Byzantine agreement, we have all processors broadcast their inputs using the protocol for Byzantine broadcast, right? So you just go through n different versions of that protocol. So each one takes their input, they broadcast that to the others. Okay, then once the values decided correspond to each processor, processors then decide by majority vote, right? Breaking ties in some arbitrary fashion. So essentially what you're doing here is you're just executing that majority vote protocol we talked about before, but you're getting rid of the problem that dishonest guys can say different things to different processors, right? If they go via the Byzantine broadcast protocol, you will get over that problem, yeah? Okay. So that's one direction. Other direction is also quite simple. So if we can solve Byzantine agreement, then to solve Byzantine broadcast, we just have the broadcaster send their input to all of the processors at time 0. Okay, if we're in the synchronous setting, then that should arrive by time slot 1. Yeah. So each processor then takes the value received at time 1 as their input value, or if they didn't get anything because the broadcaster is not honest, then they just make something up. Yeah. Okay, then we just have the processors carry out a protocol for Byzantine agreement on those input values. Is that clear? Okay, so there's a sort of fairly easy reduction in both directions. So the result is, okay, so they're not the same problem, but if we work in the synchronous setting, and if f is less than n over 2, then they're reducible to each other. And I guess the consequence of this is, overall, so far, it seems like we only really have to worry about Byzantine broadcast. Because if Byzantine broadcast is impossible, then Byzantine agreement is definitely impossible. And if Byzantine broadcast is impossible, the other one is as well, right? Okay, so if you work out for which f you can do Byzantine broadcast, that gives you the result for Byzantine agreement, so long as you're in the synchronous setting. Is that clear? Okay. Okay, so now let's get on to the results. Okay, so we'll start off with, I guess, the easiest one. So it's easiest if you've got a PKI. Okay, so we're in the synchronous setting. We send messages, they arrive at the next time slot. We can imagine we have a public key infrastructure. And the result here is that there exists a protocol that solves the Byzantine broadcast problem for any number of faulty processors. Okay, so this result is originally due to Lamport, Shostak, and Peace, but I'm going to talk you through a more elegant protocol by Dolov and Strong. Okay, and as I just said, so we're talking about Byzantine broadcast here, but this also deals with Byzantine agreement, right? So by the reductions we just discussed, also suffices to show that we can solve Byzantine agreement in a synchronous setting with PKI, even only if f is less than n over 2. Okay, because Byzantine agreement just generally isn't possible if f is greater or equal to n over 2. But if f is less than n over 2, then you can use Byzantine broadcast to solve Byzantine agreement. Okay. Okay, so we only have to worry about Byzantine broadcast, that's what we're going to do. And again, maybe before we sort of talk through proof, maybe it's worth sort of thinking about why it isn't trivial. So we talked about why Byzantine agreement wasn't trivial before, with the majority of votes sort of thing, but now we're talking about Byzantine broadcast, and now also we've got a PKI, so maybe it's worth sort of thinking about it again a little bit, okay? So what might be an obvious sort of way to proceed? So an obvious way to try solving Byzantine broadcast, if you've got a public key infrastructure, right? Remember, you've got one guy, he's the broadcaster, and we're trying to get everybody to sort of agree on his value if he's honest, right? So an obvious thing to do would be to have the broadcaster send out signed versions of the values of the versions of their inputs to all the other processors at the beginning, right? Okay, and obviously if they're honest, they'll send everybody the same signed value. Yeah. If they're dishonest, they might be sending different people different things. Yeah. So we'll start off like that. Okay, then the processors could just repeatedly share all the signed values they've seen produced by the broadcaster. Yeah. If they only ever see a single value produced, then they output that value. Okay, we're happy then, they've all terminated, they've all agreed. Okay, and if the broadcaster's honest, they're only ever seeing this single value he's sending out, so they're outputting the correct value, so we're happy. On the other hand, if they see two different values being produced, okay, then they realize the broadcaster is faulty, because an honest broadcaster, a non-faulty broadcaster, wouldn't send out two different signed values, versions of their initial value, right? So in that case, well, they know that the broadcaster is faulty, so all they've got to do is agree on some value. It doesn't have to be their value. So in that case, they just get some default value as their output. Okay? That would be the idea, right? This doesn't work, right? But, yeah. Okay, so the idea is, if the broadcaster is non-faulty, then they'll only produce a single signed value, and all non-faulty processors will output that. That sounds good. Okay? On the other hand, if the broadcaster produces two different signed values and shows them to non-faulty processors, okay, then the idea is everybody will eventually see those two values and they'll give the default output. Okay, in that case, we're fine as well. Okay, so that's the idea. Hopefully it's also fairly clear what the problem with that is. The problem is, okay, so when do we stop sharing values, right? So we share values up until time t, then what the adversary can do is he can just show everybody like one particular value up until time t, and then at time t, when it's too late to share anymore, then he suddenly shows some subset of the honest processors two different values. Okay, so then some of them would go to the default value, some of them might give another value, and you've broken the agreement property. Yeah? You see that? Okay, so the problem is, when do we stop sharing values, right? Basically, wherever you put the cutoff, the adversary can start playing games with sort of showing different processes different things at that exact sort of cutoff. Okay, and again, you might sort of think, well, there must be something simple I can do here, something will work out. But in fact, you can kind of show that nothing really simple will work, because if you have F faulty processors, you can show you need at least F plus 1 rounds of communication. So there's no really simple answer here. Okay. Okay, so let's see the nice solution by Donovan Strong. Okay, so what we need is a clever mechanism here to ensure that if any non-faulty processor, let's say, recognizes a certain value produced by the broadcaster, okay, then they all recognize that value. Yeah. Right, so if you have the case, okay, whenever any non-faulty processor recognizes a certain value, then they all do. Okay, then what that means is that either they all recognize a single value produced by the broadcaster, and they all like output that single value, or they all recognize multiple values, so they all give the default value. Okay, so if we can ensure that this is true, then we're happy. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay, that's what we want. Okay, so here's the mechanism. It's quite sort of elegant. So at time 0, the broadcaster sends a signed version of their input to each processor. Again, if they're honest, they'll send the same value to everybody. If they're dishonest, there might be multiple values there. At time 1, the processors look to see whether they've received a signed value from the broadcaster, and if so, they sort of recognize that value. Okay, they recognize this is a value that the broadcaster has produced. Okay. So now, though, rather than just passing on that signed value to other processors, what they do is they attach their own signature to the message. So now it's been signed twice, okay, first by the broadcaster, then by them, and then they send that new version of the message to all processors. Okay. Okay, then more generally, we stipulate that if the processor is to recognize a new value at any time t, then the message has got to be signed by t distinct processors. Okay? And if they recognize a new value at time t, then they add their signature to the list, and they send that new message out now with t+1 signatures. Okay, so at time slot 0, the broadcaster sends out signed versions of their input. At time slot 1, other processors receive that. It's got one signature. At time slot 1, so they're happy to recognize that value. Then they add a second signature, send that out at time slot 1. If other processors receive that at time slot 2, it's now got two distinct signatures, so they're happy to recognize it. They might then add a third signature and so on. At time slot 3, people will be happy to recognize it if they see three distinct signatures on it. Okay, and the signatures have to be distinct, okay, from different processors. Okay, so that one there is a generalization of that, so I'm just going to encapsulate everything in this shorter description there. Okay, so I've got some more space on the slide. Yeah. Are you happy with that process? Okay. Okay, then finally, just at the end, what we do, so it's going to be a sort of a finite process. We're going to have f+1 many stages, so termination will be automatic. Everyone's just going to terminate after f+1 rounds. So at time f+1, we give the processors a last chance to recognize new values, but they can't share again. Okay? And then what they do is they either output the single value they've recognized, if it's only a single value, or if they've recognized more than one value, they'll go to the default option. Okay, so is the protocol clear, first of all? Yeah, okay. Okay, so now let's see what that works. So we have to show that if any non-faulty processor recognizes a certain value, okay, then they all do. Okay, and as long as that's the case, we're entirely happy. That's what we have to show. So there are two different cases to consider here. Okay, so first of all is the easy case. Let's suppose some non-faulty processor I first recognizes some value before it's too late to share. Okay, in that case, it's quite simple. Basically, they just have to add their signatures or share the value, right? So I suppose some non-faulty processor I first recognizes V at some time t strictly before f+1 when it's not too late to share. Okay, so what does that mean? So in that case, I receives a message relaying the value v at time t, which has t distinct signatures attached. Otherwise, I wouldn't recognize that value at that time, right? It's going to have t distinct signatures for I to recognize the value. Okay? So processor I then adds their signature to form a message with t+1 distinct signatures, and they send that to all processors. Okay, so that means all non-faulty processors will recognize v by the next time slot. Okay, so that was a sort of easy case. You've recognized the value, but it's not too late to share that value with other people. So next we come to what might be the tricky case, right? It's when you learn about it right at the end, before when it's too late to tell other people about it. See what happens there. So suppose next that some non-faulty processor I first recognizes v at time f+1, right, when it's too late to share. So in that case, I receives a message relaying the value v at time slot f+1, which has f+1 distinct signatures attached, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't recognize the value at that time slot. Okay, but if it's got f+1 distinct signatures attached, that means at least one of those signatures must be from a non-faulty processor, right? Because we've only got f many faulty processors at most, right? So at least one of those signatures is from a non-faulty processor who's previously relayed the message. Okay? And that means, so let's suppose it's signed by that non-faulty processor as J, that means that case 1 applies with respect to J. Right, so J has already seen the value at some previous time slot and has shared it, and now everybody knows about it anyway. Yeah, yeah, so I guess it's quite slick, that last little turn there. Yeah. Okay, so that's the Dolev-Strong protocol. I think on the slides I wrote down a sort of formal version, but maybe it's not that useful to go through the formal version, and we started a little bit late, so I think I'll carry on. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so in that protocol we used f+1 rounds of communication, and in fact in the original paper where Dolev and Strong produced that protocol, they showed that f+1 rounds are necessary. Okay, so yeah, so it's clear you can't do something that's really trivial anyway. Okay, so that was our first theorem. So with PKI, you can basically deal with any number of faulty processors. So next, very famous theorem is the following one. So consider the synchronous setting without PKI. So here, no protocol could solve Byzantine agreement or Byzantine broadcast when f is greater or equal to n over 3. Okay, so again, This is originally due to Lamport, Shostak, and Peace, but the proof I'm going to talk you through here is a much nicer proof by Fisher, Lynch, and Merritt. And I'm going to sort of present it in a way that's a little bit different than usual as well. So maybe if you have seen the proof before, maybe this will still be interesting. Okay, so again, so we're solving it for Byzantine agreement, okay, but that gives the result also for Byzantine broadcast because they're reducible to each other when f is less than n over 2. Yeah, and I'm going through the Fisher, Lynch, Merritt version of the proof. Okay, so in order to give a nice proof where you understand exactly why all elements of the proof are there, I'm going to first of all, sort of change our formal framework a little bit. Okay, and then we'll change it back and give, we'll give a full proof for the full framework, but the proof will be nicer if this will go via a modified version first, okay? Okay, so according to our formal framework, the way we set things up, so each processor has a private communication channel to each of the processors, and you know right at the start, like which processor is at the end of each of those channels, right? So if I'm processor I and I've got a communication channel to J, then right at the start of the protocol execution, I know that J is at the end of that channel. Yeah. Just briefly, though, to make things a little bit simpler, let's consider an alternative setup in which processors no longer begin with knowledge as to which processor is at the end of each of their channels. Okay, so we still have one channel for each of the processors, but now at the beginning, I don't know who is at the end of each. Okay, so there's a 5-processor execution. If I'm one of the guys involved, and I've got 4 different channels, right, and only one person can write something to me along each of them, but I just don't know who's at the end of each of those channels at the beginning. Okay. Okay, so in this situation, we can describe like a simple proof by contradiction. The approach might seem a little bit odd at first, because what we do is we suppose a working protocol exists. Okay, and then we deduce certain things about how the protocol must behave in scenarios like other than the intended application, right? Which might seem an odd sort of thing to do. Okay, but it works out because the analysis allows us to quickly deduce that actually there are sort of valid situations in which the protocol can't behave properly. Okay, so that sounds a little abstract. Okay, I'll make that concrete right now. Okay, so let's start off with the case n is 3 and f is 1. Okay, so we've got considering 3 processes, or a protocol for 3 processes where at most 1 is faulty. Okay, let's suppose we've got a working protocol. Okay, and let's do something a little crazy. Let's consider what happens when 4 processes all execute the protocol for n is 3 and f is 1. And suppose they all execute the protocol correctly. Okay, but they do it when we set up the communication channels in some odd fashion like that. Okay, and I'll explain what this picture means. So each node here is a different processor. Okay, they've got this is the processor 0. This is the processor 1. But this is the processor 1 down here. This is the processor 0 prime and processor 1 prime. Okay, and we're going to suppose that if you're 0 or 0 prime, they're both told that the name is 0. Whether you're 1 or 1 prime, you're both told that your name is 1. Okay, so we're thinking that we know they're different processes, but they don't. Okay, as far as they're concerned, they've got the same names as each other. And the A and B's there, that's just their inputs. Okay, so processor 0 has input A, processor 1 prime has input B, processor 1 has input A, and so on. Okay, so is that clear? Okay, so this might seem like a sort of strange sort of setup, but it's clearly, it makes sense to consider it, right? You might not be immediately clear why you're considering it, but it makes sense to sort of set things up like this. Each processor's got a certain input. At each stage, they're going to receive messages along each of their communication channels. The protocol tells them what messages to send. You just okay, we can ask the question, so what happens then in this odd setup, right?
So the assumption is that they're communicating in a ring, it's not a complete graph?
Yeah, so they're just communicating in a ring, exactly right. So each of these guys, you can sort of think that they're kind of unaware what the main context is, right? They're just sitting there. I've got 2 communication channels. I'm just following the protocol. You send me some messages. I go through my instructions. That determines what I send out, and we just see what happens, right? Okay. Okay. So yeah. So these are 0, 1, 0 prime, and 1 prime. But as far as they're concerned, right? So if you're processor I or I prime, they're told their name is I. Okay. And again, the A's and B's are just their inputs. Okay, so again, so each process is just going to act entirely honestly here, okay? They're not going to deviate from the protocol at all. Okay, and we're going to wonder what happens As I say, this is not a configuration in which the protocol is intended to operate, but we're going to analyze what happens here, and it's going to allow us to deduce some contradictions to the idea that it's a valid protocol. Okay, so what can we say about how things will unfold here? Well, the first thing we can say is that processors 0 and 1 here, okay, they both have to output A. Why? Because this 4 processor execution is indistinguishable, as far as they're concerned, from the 3 processor execution, right? In which, so they're given the inputs A, and there's a second processor, processor 2 over here is faulty, and just simulates the processors 0' and 1' here. Okay, so each stage, processor 1' sends to 0 what processor, sorry, the simulating processor, processor 2, sends to 0 what processor 1' sends in this 4 processor execution, right? And the faulty processor, the one who's simulating these two guys here, he sends to processor 1 what processor 0' sends in this 4 processor execution. Okay? And when I say that the two executions are indistinguishable, I mean that with respect to, from the perspective of a particular processor, that means they have the same input and they see exactly the same messages at each stage, right? So this 4 processor execution is indistinguishable as far as these two guys are concerned from a 3 processor execution in which the third processor is faulty and simulates these two here. Happy with that? Okay, so in that situation, all the non-faulty processors have input A, so they have to terminate and output A. Okay, but then similarly, and just by symmetry, okay, so these two guys here, 1' and 0', they have to terminate and output B, right? Because this 4 processor execution is indistinguishable, as far as they're concerned, from the 3 processor execution, right? In which the third node is faulty and just simulates these two processors here. Yeah. Okay, so these two guys have to output B. So far we've determined, so these two guys have to output A, these two guys have to output B. Okay, but now we get to a contradiction, okay, because we've already determined that 0 outputs A, 1' outputs B, but now this 4 processor execution is indistinguishable, as far as they're concerned, from a 3 node execution in which these two guys are honest and this guy is faulty and simulates these two nodes here. Okay, but now we've got a problem because they've given different outputs. Okay, so we violated the agreement requirement. Yeah.
So I see that hexagon, like,
Yeah, we'll come to that.
why? Oh.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So my question when I saw the hexagon is, why do you need a hexagon? So that's why I'm giving you the 4-node version first, and now you see why you need the hexagon. Okay, so we'll see that in a second. So that's the right question. Okay. So we've got our contradiction, but this was all in our modified setup, where I suppose we begin the whole thing without knowing who's at the end of each channel. Okay. If we now go back to the full setup, try and do the same argument as a bit of a problem, okay? Problem now is we have to be more careful about deciding how to treat each channel during the indistinguishability arguments, okay? So it's not really that deep, but okay, let's go through it. So let's consider first processors 0 and 1. So 0 and 1 treat the channel between them as the channel 0, 1, okay? And of each processor I and 0, 1 treats the channel between, well, I and 1, 1 as I prime, as the channel I2. So if 0 treats this as the channel 0, 2, and 1 treats this as the channel 1, 2, okay, then it is indistinguishable from this 3 processor execution in which the faulty processor simulates these two. So then in that situation, you can conclude they both output A. Okay, and then similarly, okay, if you reverse I and I prime there, okay, so if they're both regarding this as the channel 1, 0, and this guy regards this as the channel 1, 2, he regards this as the channel 0, 2. Then again, you can conclude that they must both output B, but then you get into a problem in the final step of the argument, right? Because now the execution doesn't look indistinguishable from any valid execution as far as 0 and 1' are concerned. Because we just said, so 0 has to treat this as the channel 0, 2, and 1' has to treat this as the channel 1, 2, which they never would. Okay, so it's just a sort of like a rather silly problem, really, with the fact that you're given the wrong names, or you have to assume the wrong names for people at the end of your channels. Okay, but then we can solve that quite easily by doing the hexagon. Okay, so if you've seen the proof before, that's why the hexagon is there. I don't think it's very clear then when you read the original proof. Okay, so we solved that just by sticking 2 guys in the middle, what we call 2 and 2'. Okay. Okay, so we introduced 2 and 2 prime. We suppose each processor with the name I or I prime is told their name is I. Okay, so 2 prime is told their name is 2, 2 is also told their name is 2. Okay, and they treat the channels just in the obvious way. So these 2 treat this as the channel 0, 2, these 2 treat this as the channel 1, 2, and so on. Yep. Okay, so now you don't really have to think through the tedious details you don't want. Now basically the same argument works. Okay, so now you can conclude these 2 have to output A because this is indistinguishable. This 6 processor execution is now indistinguishable as far as they're concerned from a 3 processor execution in which one guy simulates these 4. Similarly, these 2 here have to output B because the 6 processor execution is indistinguishable as far as they're concerned from a 3 processor execution, in which the faulty processor simulates all these 4 nodes over here. And again, now you reach your contradiction because now you have 2 non-faulty processors giving different outputs when this 6 processor execution is indistinguishable from a 3 processor execution in which they shouldn't be giving different outputs. Okay, so I guess, yeah, don't worry too much about the details here. It's essentially the same as the 4 node thing, but now it works out with the names. Okay. Good, okay, so where are we? Okay, so that was just for the case n is 3 and f is 1, but okay, basically that gives you the general case as well. Okay, so if you suppose there exists some n greater than 3 and f greater or equal to n over 3 for which the protocol works, well then you could use that to get a working protocol for n is 3 and f is 1. Basically, you just divide all the processors up into equal groups of equal size, so they're all of size at most f, and you have each of the 3 processors control like one of those sets of processors. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the proof we went through was for case n is 3 and f is 1, but that immediately gives you the general case, basically, right? Because if you had a protocol work for any other f and any other n and any other f greater than n over 3, you could very easily use that to get a protocol that worked for n is 3 and f equals 1, which we've just shown is impossible. Okay, so where are we? So far, we're still in the synchronous setting. We saw if you have a PKI, you can deal with any number of faults. You have this sort of Dolev-Strong type protocol. We've seen consider the synchronous setting without PKI, so we know no protocol can solve BA or BB when f is greater than n over 3. So the next thing we want to do is show that, okay, when f is less than n over 3, you can. Okay, so that sort of ties things up so far, right? Okay, so we're considering the synchronous setting without PKI. We want a protocol that works when f is less than n over 3. Okay. Okay, so again, it suffices to prove the theorem for Byzantine agreement. That'll give us the result for Byzantine broadcast. So the theorem was originally proved by Lamport, Shostak, and Peace, but I don't think that initial proof is that sort of informative. So what I'm going to do instead is give a more instructive proof by Berman, Garay, and Parry, or a slight adjustment of that, which is known as the phase gain protocol. Okay. So yeah, I guess this protocol is probably the most complicated one I'm going to talk through today or Thursday. So I don't know if the previous proofs were easy or hard, but anyway, so you have to maybe concentrate a little bit to follow this one, but I don't think it should be too hard. Anyway. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to describe a protocol called the phase king protocol. Right, it's going to show us how to solve Byzantine agreement when f is less than n over 3. First of all, though, I'm going to explain the main protocol. I'm going to show you first of all like a simple 2-step sub-protocol, okay, which is called gradecast. Okay, so with gradecast, just as for Byzantine agreement, each processor receives an input. Okay, and now they have to give an output, just as they did before, but now they also have to output a grade together with that value, a grade either 0, 1, or 2. Okay, and the grade is going to indicate something about the knowledge the processor has regarding other processors' outputs. Okay. Okay, so it's a very simple protocol. So what I'm going to do basically, I'm going to sort of throw it at you, and then we'll start talking about what it achieves. Okay. Okay. So step 1. So this is the instructions for processor I. So processor I has their input V. Okay. Their first instruction, step 1, is just send V to all processors. Okay. Simple enough. Step 2. Okay, so if n minus f distinct processes send B to I, right? This should say to I here in step 1, then I will send B to all processes. Okay, so first step, you just send your value out. Next step, you're waiting to see if there's some value that like, lots of people sent me. In fact, if it's n minus f, then I'll send out that value in the next step. Yeah. Hopefully it's clear why we consider n minus f here. If you ask for anything more than that, then, well, the faulty processes can just not do anything and you won't send anything. Okay. Okay, so first of all, so you're sending V to all processes. And then step 2, if n minus f distinct processes send B in step 1, then you send B to all processes. Okay. So far, I guess it might not be immediately clear exactly why that step 2 is there, but we'll see why. Okay, so that's the end of basically the protocol, but now we have to decide how to output. Okay, so we output as follows. So if n minus f distinct parties send B to I, that is, in round 2, that should say step 2, there's a typo, so in step 2, then you output B with grade 2. Okay, so if n minus f distinct parties send B in round 2, in step 2, then output B with grade 2. Otherwise, if that's not the case, if f plus 1 distinct parties send B in step 2, then output B with grade 1. Okay, and otherwise output V with grade 0. So I realise it might seem initially a bit mysterious what these grades meaning and stuff, but we're going to sort of talk through what it means, okay? It will be quite simple. Okay, so that's the whole protocol. So hopefully you agree that it's quite a simple protocol. Well, this is the sub-protocol, right? Okay, great cast. Okay, but then we don't yet understand what that does or what it's defined the way it is, but let's think about it, okay? So there's the protocol. Just put up the top of the screen. Okay, so let's examine its properties. Okay, so first of all, it's easy to see it satisfies a certain form of validity, right? So if all non-faulty processes have the same input value, V, then it's going to clear, they're all going to output V with grade 2. Right, that's easy to see, right? Because what will happen is, well, they all start off with value V, so they all send V to the other processes, right? That means that in step 2, every processor gets at least n minus f distinct processors sending it that value. Yeah, so they can send the value again, yeah, at step 2. Yeah. So then when they come to output, again, each of them will receive that same value from at least n minus f distinct processors. Yeah, so so you just follow it through, right? So they all start with a particular value, they'll all send that out. That means they'll receive it from at least n minus f distinct processors. The next step, so they'll send it out again. Okay? Happy with that? And then ultimately, then they'll all output with grade 2. Okay. So hopefully you agree that's a simple observation, yeah, okay. Next observation is that outputting V with grade 2 also implies knowledge about the outputs of other processes. Okay, right, so that's true because the following condition is satisfied. Okay, and we'll prove that in a bit, but I'm just going to tell you first of all it's satisfied. So we have this knowledge of agreement property. So if any non-faulty processor outputs a value B with grade 2, then in fact all non-faulty processors have to output B, maybe with some other grade, right? But if any non-faulty processor outputs a value B with grade 2, then all non-faulty processors have to output B, in fact with grade 2 or 1, okay? Okay, so what that means is, so if a non-faulty processor outputs B with grade 2, then it knows that all non-faulty processors have output B. Okay, and this is useful sort of knowledge, right? So we're trying to get to agree with each other. We're not quite sure where other people are in the process and so on. But here we know, so if a non-faulty processor outputs B with grade 2, after this really simple two-step protocol, then we know that all non-faulty processors have that same output. Yeah? Okay, and we know that if they all start with the same input, then they will output with grade 2 as well, right? Okay. Okay, so far we've got a simple process. Protocol means everybody starts with the same input, they're all going to output, end with that same value, and they'll all know that they have the same value at the end, yeah? Okay. So next, what we want to do then is we want to prove this knowledge of agreement property, so I've just written it up there. Okay, so we want to prove knowledge agreement. It's a very simple proof. We'll just do it in 2 very small steps. Okay, so first of all, we're going to prove a weak agreement property. Okay, so here it is. So if I is non-faulty and sends B in step 2, then no non-faulty processor sends a different value than B. Okay, so if B is non-faulty and so if I is non-faulty and sends a value B in step 2 there, then nobody who's non-faulty sends a different value. Right, so already we've got quite a strong form of agreement there, right? So it's not necessarily the case that they're all completely agreeing, because some people might be sending a value and some people not. But if any non-faulty processor sends the value B, even at that step 2, then nobody can send a different value. Why is that? Well, it's just a sort of counting argument, right? It's just because f is less than n over 3 here. So the faulty guys can't cause too much trouble. Okay, so let's say it. So it can't be the case that one non-faulty processor is sent B by n minus f processors in step 1, and therefore sends B in step 2, while another is sent B prime not equal to B by n minus f processors, right? Why? Because any two sets of n minus processors and n minus f processors have to have at least n minus 2f in the intersection. Right, I hope you can see that. If I've got two sets of n minus f processors, the size of the intersection is at least n minus 2f, right? Okay, maybe some sort of picture that in your head. Okay, so any two sets of n minus f processors have to have at least n minus 2f in the intersection. But n minus 2f is greater to f plus 1, because we're considering the case f is less than n over 3. Okay, so that means any two sets of n minus f processors have to have f plus 1 processors in the intersection, and that means at least one non-faulty processor in the intersection, because we've only got f faulty processors. Okay, so any two sets of n minus f processors have to have a non-faulty processor in the intersection, but non-faulty processors can't send two different values in step 1, right? They're not going to send a single value. Okay? Okay, so that means if any non-faulty processor sends B out here, because they've got n minus f, they've got sent B by n minus f distinct processors in the first step, then no other non-faulty processor can send a different B out, right? So they kind of seen that B prime not equal to B sent to them by n minus f distinct processors. Okay, so that's weak agreement, and then once you've got weak agreement, you can easily prove knowledge of agreement. So let's prove knowledge of agreement. So if a non-faulty processor outputs B with grade 2, okay, then it's sent B by at least n minus f processors in step 2. That's what the instructions say. Okay, if it outputs B with grade 2, then it's sent B by at least n minus f processors in step 2. Well, that's the instructions here. Okay, but if he sent it by at least n minus f processors, that means all non-faulty processors sent B by at least n minus 2f processors, right? Because it's only the f faulty ones that can be making things different. Okay, so they're all sent it by at least n minus 2f. So greater than f plus 1 process in step 2. So that means that anyway, that they're then anyway outputting B. Okay? Just to make sure things are well defined here, and you can't be outputting multiple B with grade 1. Note that from the weak agreement property, no non-faulty processors can be sent B prime not equal to B by f plus 1 distinct process in step 2. Okay, so that's just saying you could only output one value with one grade here. Okay. Okay. So the point of that is we've got this simple protocol, and it satisfies this nice knowledge agreement property, which says that if any non-faulty processor outputs a value B with grade 2, then all non-faulty processors output B. Okay. So where's that got us so far? Okay, so far, yeah, with a simple protocol, if all non-faulty processors start with the same input, then it produces a nice situation in which they all know that was the case. They'll all end up with that same value, but now they all know that's the case, right? That's the point of the knowledge agreement property, yeah. So what we haven't achieved yet, though, is any method for tie breaking. Okay, so everybody just starts off with mixed inputs. We've got no particular way yet of getting to agree on some common output. Okay. So how can we do that? Well, we just use a really simple method. Okay, so what we're going to do? Okay, so we're going to run f plus 1 many rounds, each of which has got a different leader. Okay. So processors start each round with a certain value. Initially, that's just their input value, but they're going to constantly update their value as these rounds go on. Okay. Each round will just start with an instance of grade cast, the simple two-step protocol we just saw. They'll just carry out grade cast. So what they'll do is they'll just, in each round, we've got f plus 1 rounds, in each round they'll just carry out grade cast, they'll update their value to the output of grade cast. Okay, and then after grade cast, the leader just shares their value, basically inviting everyone to agree with their value. Okay? So the leader just shares their value, the idea being that they're inviting people to update their value to the leader's value, so everyone now agrees. So each non-faulty processor now changes their value to that value suggested by the leader, unless they're really sure they shouldn't, right? Unless the output of the grade cast instance for that round with grade 2. Okay, so just f plus 1 rounds, each one's very simple. You just do grade cast, update your value, leader shares his value. Maybe you update to, well, either you update to that or you do update to that unless you're really sure you shouldn't because you output a grade cast with value 2. Okay, so let's see then. Okay, so if we proceed in that way, okay, so first of all, so it's easy to see that validity is going to be satisfied. Right, imagine everyone starts off with the same value. What will happen is when you run grade cast, they all end up with that same value and with grade 2, right? That's what we decided before, which means they just ignore the leader all the time, right? You only update your value to the leader's value if you didn't output grade cast with grade 2, okay? So everyone starts with the same value. You run grade cast, you end up with the same value, grade 2, you ignore the leader, take that value into the next round, you do grade cast, same value, ignore the leader, take that value into the next round, and so on, right? So no one ever changes their value. Okay, so it's clear that validity is going to be satisfied. Okay? So what do we need here? We need termination, which is automatic because it's a finite protocol, they're all going to terminate. We need validity, which I just said is really easy because if they all start with the same value, they're never going to change it. Okay, but we also need agreement, right? That's the last thing we need. So let's see why agreement is satisfied. So there's also to see that after any round with a non-faulty leader, okay, and then at all subsequent rounds, all non-faulty processes are going to have the same value. As soon as the leader is non-faulty, they're going to end up the same value. Why? Well, if a non-faulty processor doesn't change their value to the value suggested by the leader, why is that? That's because they outputted the grade cast instance with grade 2, right? But then the knowledge of agreement property says that the leader then must anyway have the same value. Right, if you outputted with grade 2, all non-faulty processes also outputted with that same value, maybe not the same grade. Right, so if there's any non-faulty processor doesn't update to the leader's value when it's suggested, well then they didn't need to update anyway because it's the same value. Yeah. Okay, so just to remind you the knowledge agreement property. So if any non-faulty processor, well, you can't see the edge there, outputs a value with grade 2 in the grade size instance, then all non-faulty processors output B, right? So that's justifying that bit there. Okay, so let's just sort of write pseudocode version of the protocol down then. Okay, so this is the instructions for processor I. So first of all, they're sort of, setting an initial value, which is just their input. Okay, then we're going to do like f plus 1 rounds, so from t equals 0 to f, you f plus 1 rounds. In each round, in the first 2 time slots, you just run an instance of grade cast. In the next time slot, you just update your value to the output of the grade cast. Okay, and then if you're the leader, so if you're in the sort of the teeth round, and if your name is T, then you send your value to all processors. Okay, and the next time slot, everybody just updates their value to the leader's value, unless they output a grade cast with grade T, with grade 2. Yeah. Okay. And at the end, you just output your value. Okay, and as I said, so validity and proof of agreement, well, we've both seen these, right? So validity follows from the validity property of grade cast, and the fact that each round the grade will be 2, meaning the leader's value is ignored, so you can just see an inductive process. Everybody starts with the same value, one grade cast, they output that same value, they ignore the leader, feed that value into the next round, and so on. Okay, so validity is satisfied. And proof of agreement, that's true because you just consider the first round with a non-faulty leader. And the knowledge of agreement property, all non-faulty processes will either switch the leader's value or already have that value with grade 2. Okay. Okay, so we're basically at the end of today's talk then. So summary of where we are so far. So Byzantine agreement and Byzantine broadcast. So they're not the same problem, but if you're in the synchronous setting, then they're equivalent to each other as long as f is less than n over 2. The first theorem we saw, so if you consider the synchronous setting with PKI, then there exists this nice protocol, Dolov-Strong, that solves Byzantine broadcast for any number of faulty processes. Then we consider the synchronous setting without PKI. So this is like 2 of the theorems we saw combined, right? So there exists protocols solving Byzantine agreement and Byzantine broadcast, even only if f is less than n over 3. Okay, so what we're going to do next time is consider state machine replication. That's basically right, the protocol that blockchains protocol normally solve, like protocols like Bitcoin solve. I don't think we'll actually look at crash faults, but then we'll all do the same. We'll do the sort of similar questions for the partially synchronous setting. Actually, basically, I'm going to sort of simplify things a bit. Basically, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how Tendermint works and that will sort of solve everything for us. Okay, it's a 10-bit. I think it's actually a sort of simpler protocol than that phase clean protocol. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we'll do that all next time. So that's.